With all the doomsday pronouncements about our world, or perhaps the near end of it, you might think that loneliness comes way down the list of things to worry about. But it is a problem that's growing, and the dangers it poses are at last being recognised. You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Around the world, more and more people are living alone, which is not necessarily the same as loneliness, which is so bad in the UK right now that the government has created a minister for it. Older people in Japan are so desperate for social engagement, they have turned to crime.
Loneliness is for many an inevitable part of being human, but recent studies have shown how harmful loneliness can be. It can even lead to premature death. So is there a new type of loneliness spreading like an epidemic in the advanced economies? And if it is such a big social ill, what is the remedy? Japan was traditionally a country of strong family bonds that meant children looked after their elders. The population of seniors there is 27%, twice the level of the US. Huge numbers of Japanese pensioners have been committing petty crimes just to get into prison. They view jail not as a punishment, but an improvement in their quality of life. On the inside, they find the social ties and a support system they lack on the outside. On average, 1 out of every 5 inmates is senior, more than 3 times the rate in the US. But it's not just seniors who are beset by loneliness. In the UK, it was young people aged 16 to 24 who reported feeling more lonely than pensioners. The country was the first in the world to appoint a minister to combat loneliness. The government move came thanks to the work of murdered MP Jo Cox. The UK government has set aside $26 million to combat the social effects of loneliness. MP Rachel Reeves continued Jo Cox's work after her death and said, in the last few decades, loneliness has escalated from personal misfortune into a social epidemic. It's an epidemic that increases the risk of heart disease, depression and anxiety disorders. The rise of social media has coincided with higher rates of mood disorders among younger people. Passive use of social media correlates with higher levels of depression. This increases the sense of loneliness and perpetuates a vicious cycle. Strangely, the more we adapt to groups just like ourselves, the higher the rates of loneliness tend to be. Loneliness may well have reached epidemic levels in the advanced world, but is the machinery of government the right agent to effect change? And as a hyper-social species, are we losing sight of what ensures our survival?
And I'm very pleased to say that we can welcome on Skype from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Dr. Jackie Olds, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, written a number of books about loneliness, with me in the studio. Dr. Johanna Harris from Exeter University and convener of the Exeter Care Homes Project. We'll talk about that during the programme. We have Eleanor Botwright, Chief Executive of Castlehaven Community Association in London, done interesting things with lonely young and old people. And Marjorie Wallace with us as well, founder and chief executive of the mental health charity SANE. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Marjorie, let me ask you first of all, just for the general picture, what do you think loneliness is?
Well, loneliness is a very big spectrum. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think there's a world of difference between people feeling lonely, because everyone does. It's a sort of normal part of the human condition to feel lonely for some days, some time, but they know that it's probably temporary, probably passing, and they can reach out and find some ways of dealing with it. And isolation, social isolation, which is quite a different feeling. People feel, they describe it as being in a glass cage suspended around the world. They see everything that's going on, people talking, but they cannot reach out and they cannot be heard. And the connections between them and everybody else in the outside world have been broken. And that is a very frightening feeling and can be very damaging to both physical and mental health, and in fact can be fatal. It actually robs people of life.
Why do you think it's
takes
getting
their
worse,
lives away?
or appears to be getting worse?
I think what's happening is that there's more awareness of it, but I think that it's also being driven by and driving mental illness, which is also seems to be on the increase. I mean, depression particularly. Depression is going to be the greatest global burden of disease worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. And so they interweave and they're driving each other. And I think part of it is the fragmentation of society. Part of it is, and I think a large part of it is, the social media.
Jackie, let me come to you first of all. I mentioned you'd written about loneliness in the 21st century, but go back to a book you wrote in 1996, Overcoming Loneliness in Everyday Life. What led you to identify this as an important topic more than 20 years ago?
Well, as a psychiatrist in everyday practice with many, many people, loneliness was almost always a factor in their coming into the office. But they wouldn't mention it until they'd gotten to know me much better because they were so embarrassed and ashamed of being lonely. So we wrote that book so that essentially loneliness could be brought out of the closet, so that people would understand it was a social phenomenon, not just their individual flaw. And they wouldn't feel so embarrassed about it.
Why the shame?
I think in America for many years, if you admitted you were lonely, first of all, there was such an emphasis on individualism that you were supposed to be quite happy if you were by yourself. You were supposed to feel, you know, a sense of success that you could be alone and not need other people. So there was a kind of antipathy toward dependency and a pride in being a solitary individual who was making it. But I think they felt ashamed because if they said, I'm lonely, that meant they were a loser.
And Marjorie
And they
suggests, sorry, I just jumped in probably at the wrong point there,
Yeah.
but let me continue. Marjorie suggested that social media is in part to blame, and I know this is a belief that you have as well, isn't it, that it isolates rather than brings people together?
I think it does both. For some very isolated people, it's better than nothing. But I think I would place the cause in a sort of different direction. I think the prosperous countries have let people have their own way in almost every regard. They can live alone in just the place they want to live. They can work from home. They don't have to shop. They don't have to attend a religious institution. So they do so many things alone that they're sort of accidentally trapped into a bubble.
Let's bring it back to the studio and you two who have specific projects. Johanna, I'll ask you about the Exeter student ones in just a moment, but let's go with you, Eleanor, to North London, where you started to bring groups of people that may well have felt isolated or frightened in their own way together. Old people, young people, projects.
We are a community association that works across the age spectrum, so we were well placed to start looking at how we can get people almost by accident initially to start engaging with each other, running joint initiatives that were low stress, casual, but socially focused, like intergenerational quiz, for instance.
And this helps with loneliness and isolation?
Absolutely. You'll get people sitting around a table, talking about the answers to a question and starting a conversation. By the end of the session, they've built up a relationship with somebody that they're going to pass in the passageway or in the building again at some future point. So it helps them build a relationship as a one-off and as an ongoing
There's a nice story about the hoodies and the gangs. Tell us about that one.
Oh gosh, it was some years ago, and it is one of my favourite stories. Some years ago when hoodies were the thing, all kids wearing hoods were potential murderers or whatever. And to gain access to our community centre, some of our older users had to walk past a corner on which stood a group of young kids with their hoods up. So we worked for a while trying to figure out how we get them into a room and talk about it so that at least even if the kids kept wearing the hoods, they'd understand why it was intimidating the elders. So we developed a kind of a question time panel with the police and the local journalists and some oldies, and invited the oldies and the kids in to have a debate. And one crucial point I remember in the session itself was one of the elderly ladies standing up and saying to a very tall young man with his hood up like this in the back, and she said, "Excuse me, young man, would you please be kind enough to take your hood off?" So he did, and she went, "Oh my goodness, you're handsome." And that instant just kind of broke the ice, and everybody kind of giggled at the same time. And
then they started hanging out together, didn't they?
The next week, after the session, Desmond and I have left the building again. On the corner are a group of hoodies And there with them were some of our oldies.
And in terms of mental health, i.e. loneliness and isolation, what change did that bring about for both groups?
Absolutely. I think that they just started talking to each other. I think hanging out together all on a phone is one thing, but hanging out together, talking to each other and engaging and understanding somebody else's perspective helps them to appreciate
Which
that
is
they're
what,
not on
to
their
a certain extent, Johanna, you and the people at Exeter University are doing. You're subsidising some student rents, yeah, on the condition that students go into care homes or places where elderly people live and engage with them. And the benefits are what?
Well, that's a new part of this project that's been running for about 7 years, where our students in the English department go into local care homes ostensibly to read to the residents, but that's sort of an excuse just to forge friendships, really, and things go from there. And the subsidising of the rent is a project, we're calling it the Exeter Co-Living Scheme, and it's beginning this September, where we've been given some funding to pilot some students living in a local care home to spend social hours with the residents, just to increase that level of social interaction on a regular. They'll be contracted to do this, so on a daily basis.
Hopefully the benefits being what?
On both sides, greater happiness, well-being, reducing a sense of loneliness, and I think to bring it to young people, from the students' perspective, giving them a sense of balance actually in their university lives, because they tend to exist in a sort of generational bubble, really.
Well, we saw a little bit of it in that filmed report, didn't we, about the young people feeling isolated as well. There's a tendency, is there not, to think that old people are going to be lonely because they're often on their own, their partners have died, their friends groups have been split up, but it is young people increasingly, Marjorie, is it?
Yeah, the recent report that we just heard says that the people reporting loneliness most frequently are the 16 to 24-year-olds, young women, adolescent girls. And actually that coincides with an increase in the doubling the self-harm in that age group. They self-harm very badly. When I started SANE, we had a helpline, and helplines open to everybody with any kind of troubles. And we would hear occasionally about young girls, teenagers and young women slashing their wrists or taking a small overdose. Now we hear day in, day out of young girls taking very brutal methods of slashing, of gouging, taking poison. And that's a new phenomenon. So I think what we're looking at is a much more aggressive, and loneliness has become a much more, as you said, shameful thing for people. They don't want to be losers. They're exposed 24/7 to the fact they may be losers, and they're lashing out at themselves largely in a much more aggressive way.
So let's try and examine ways that you all think we can perhaps tackle this, A, by bringing it out in the open, and secondly, by practical means. You've heard, Jackie, you've heard about the fact that the UK now has a loneliness minister. She's only been in post for the course of this year. We don't know very much about what she's been able to do so far. But that in itself is a good step, or could it just be lip service?
Well, I think it's a good step, because I think it publicizes the fact that it's a massive total problem. And I think whenever you can bring that kind of publicity to a problem and say it's not just this individual's problem or that individual's problem, then suddenly you have people being willing to talk about it with other people, which starts to solve the problem.
What is it, the physical effects of this? It's not just mental ones, isn't it? I mean, Jackie, you can answer this, and then we'll kick it around the table here. Age UK, Mark Robinson, said loneliness can kill. It's proven to be worse for health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, but it can be overcome. How can it, in your opinion, Jackie, be overcome? What do we do about it?
So there's so many things we could do differently. We could start teaching children in the elementary schools about social relationships and the skills of cooperation and friendship. We could start making it easier for people to work at work rather than work at home. And we could stop doing so much to essentially encourage people to communicate remotely as if it were a high status privilege rather than something that could lead to trouble. There are many things. I think what Eleanor and Johanna are doing are fantastic. And in this country, there are a few little places, like there's an old person's living arrangement where all the care, all the waitressing and all the food preparation is done by college students who live on the same campus. So I think those kinds of ideas are superb.
The difficulty is there, you talk about not remote working, getting people to go out more. The genie's out of the bottle with that, isn't it? We've got to think of other ways of doing it, because you're not going to stop people from not wanting to work at home, encouraging them to commute when we're being told that it's bad for the climate to have road trips and rail trips all the time. So what do you do?
I think encouraging further intergenerational interaction is a big thing. I think that brings a lot of benefits that aren't being talked about enough, including health benefits. So we've seen where nurseries are integrated with care homes, for instance, in a few places around the world. That's brought immense even medical benefits to some of the older residents.
Where is that?
I think it was happening, there's one in Japan that's been running since the 70s, and just a couple of places around the world.
It sort of seems so obvious. Why has nobody thought of this sort of thing before?
Yeah, you'd think so, and it shouldn't necessarily be too expensive either.
And your thoughts, Eleanor? I mean, you're on the practical side of things. Other than what you're doing or the benefits of what you're doing, what do you see as the way forward?
I think it's about encouraging and supporting engagement across the spectrum. Before I move to that, though, I'd just like to make
any points you want at any time. Please don't wait for me to ask.
About having a portfolio, an MP with loneliness as part of a portfolio. We have, but it's a huge issue that's been bolted onto an already very full portfolio. So I think that...
you mean because she's also sports minister?
She's sports minister.
Leisure.
Civil society,
and
gambling.
civil society, and, you know, there's...
So does it mean it's lip service?
I'd hate to think that it's lip service, but it feels like that. I suggest that it just needs to be reconsidered, and that we need... The subject is already a huge subject, and it's growing, and it's going to get worse. It deserves better attention.
What are the effects of it then, not just on the individual, but on society?
I think that we're becoming much more disjointed as a society anyway, as a result of the housing strategy and poverty, families being relocated or broken up so that young family members or young adults no longer afford to live in the inner cities, so they're having to go someplace else. So we get students that don't have access to their grandparents, and grandparents that don't have access to their grandchildren.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I agree with it, this is such a huge problem. It's like solving the problem of humanity. You can't, I mean, loneliness is part of the human condition. You can't just say, well, I'm a minister and somehow loneliness will be solved. You've got to look at the different types of loneliness, of the different groups of people. Now, in our world, there are different groups. People who are old are one group, but then there are people who are physically disabled or mentally ill, people who can't leave their homes because they're too scared to go out because they have panic attacks. Now, we need to be dealing with these people at a really deep level, be treating them much more effectively than we are doing. Then you've got the men who don't talk about loneliness because they don't like to admit to it, and yet they are 3 times more likely to take their own lives. And then there's another group, which I think we must always remember, which are carers. Now, there is somewhere we can do something about, because they are able to make connections. And 8 out of 10, in this particular report, 8 out of 10 of carers said that they were very lonely. Now, we can reach out to the carers by giving them some relief from the care. They can be young carers, children with mentally ill parents, or children with disabled parents. They can be older people looking after each other. You know, one person dies and the other person's left alone, or somebody is caring for an old mother or father. Now, these people have nothing often. They don't have counsellors on the NHS, our National Health Service system. They don't qualify for any help. Now, here we should be putting a lot of the 20 million that we've been given into tackling a group.
Drop in the ocean, really, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that we should do, I think, in this country and probably all countries, a massive education of the medical people who are seeing patients regularly, but not necessarily asking about their relationships. So that needs to be a topic that we ask about as much as smoking or obesity or diabetes. It's just such an important topic. Secondly, I do think that bringing people together intergenerationally is incredibly important. And I don't know how it is in the UK, but in America, I'd say about 50% of people live within 50 miles of their parents. But the other 50% might live 3,000 miles from their parents. And so that's not such a practical thing to be able to bring those families together. But I agree with all of you that if you bring them together with other older people, that's a kind of substitute and is gratifying to both generations.
The UK government said, I think it was quoted in that report, that this, a personal misfortune is becoming a social epidemic. What are the consequences, do you think, of that as somebody who studies people's minds and the way they work, Jackie?
You mean that loneliness is a
Yeah, it's a personal
misfortune?
misfortune, but it's becoming a social epidemic. If it's an epidemic, what are the consequences?
Well, the consequences are more depression, more early death, premature death, more of a sense of polarization in the society that we've been seeing, especially in America, where one side can't imagine even talking to the other side. There's income disparity, there's more crime and more anxiety. So there couldn't be more consequences.
And Johanna and Eleanor as well, in terms of the positive feedback you've had, just give us some examples of the young and the old different groups. What are they saying about what's working?
I think one of the things that has really struck me has been how students who have volunteered, not necessarily having very many reasons for why, it may have been a CV enhancement for volunteering in our reading project, have just found so many reasons why they keep on visiting the care homes. They've found it so rewarding, even academically rewarding actually, because it's enhancing their sense of self-confidence, because they can speak to people outside of their own peer group. They learn how to speak well and articulately, to raise their voices for people who may have hearing trouble. So they're presenting themselves better, I think, and they're also finding that they're actually learning so much from the older generations.
And it's about confidence as well, isn't it? You don't feel lonely if you feel confident of interaction.
Yeah, indeed, and volunteering is a huge issue, actually. We especially small community association delivering a huge agenda to a very diverse group, depend a lot on volunteering of all kinds. And the volunteers, as much as the recipients, benefit. They get, especially older volunteers, feel that they've still got something to give. They're still useful members of society, that they're participants in the world rather than recipients of services.
And is this how we combat loneliness, as the UK government has said, combating loneliness one conversation at a time?
Absolutely.
By having
Absolutely.
I think that's
Yes.
a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
And can I just say, that on our helpline, which is one that's open every evening of the year, the one single expressed emotion in almost every call is loneliness. But what people are needing and what they report back is that just having somebody to listen to them, just knowing that there was one person, it's the one-on-one of that, the one person listening to their story, and not necessarily sympathising, not necessarily directing them, but listening to their story where they could feel safe to say, I feel lonely, made a huge difference in their being able to go out back to the world and approach other people. So it's being kind and listening,
What
and
do you
people should
think
be
about-
taught that.
Sorry, what do you think about the fact that we have 4 women panellists here? This was all set up in the UK after the murder of Jo Cox, who was already looking into loneliness, that the 2 women given the job of doing the commission were women MPs, and that we now have a woman minister for loneliness. What does that say about the gender situation?
Women are more touchy-feely, women are more aware, they're more sensitive to those things, and they're more willing to reach out because they're the carers. They are carers, and they're more willing to say, we can do something about it and reach out. 75% of our callers are women. It's they feel they can do something about it and they can go and help people. So that is really the difference. The men tend to keep it to themselves until it's too late.
This is where I was going to go to the psychiatrist. Jackie, I know you're holding up your hand like a good school child should. That's the problem, isn't it, is men don't talk sometimes, and men can be just as lonely, if not more so.
I think the problem is partly with our culture that we're so much more tolerant of women talking about their feelings and their loneliness. And men really are not encouraged from an early age to talk about their feelings and their neediness. They're seen as wimpy if they're needy.
Tell us about the next project you've got specifically with this in mind, Marjorie.
Well, we have a callback system whereby we have therapists who call people back who've rung out of the blue at night and they can't take on board, and help them navigate, find help, have local groups where they can volunteer, can join in. And that we want to develop. We want to have a team of therapists. We've only got about 2 at the moment.
And is lonely the word you hear the most?
Lonely is the word we hear the most.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Listen, I was scouring the web before this, just reading some material, as you obviously do before a programme of this nature, and I came across there's an awful lot of poetry about loneliness and sadness and isolation. I don't know whether this has any relevance, but Mary Havran, she's a fairly modern poet. I think she comes from Ohio, and she said, "Lonely is just one word chosen to represent so much, to tell of feelings inside that the senses cannot touch." And I suppose if we're talking about one conversation at a time, we do try and invite people at least to try and touch those feelings, bring them out into the open and talk about it. This has been one conversation. Thank you so much for taking part. Jackie in the United States, thank you to all of you at the table, and thank you very much for watching. It's been an important conversation. I hope it's been one that may have helped at least one person. We'll be back with another Roundtable very soon. From me, David Foster, from all of my guests at the Roundtable. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.